Hi, welcome back, and also welcome to the several hundred new viewers that we had on the last video. That was really amazing. Thanks for stopping by, thanks for taking the time to come and watch a video that looks really strange and has a really awkward guy on camera talking about something that you've never heard of before, just from your recommended feed, so that's really positive. Thank you very much. I realised that since we got quite a few new viewers, it would probably be good to do a secondary introduction to what actually this channel's about, what these videos are about. This is an animation project. It's something that I wanted to start for quite a few years now. It's going to be about a woman called Sally, who is the subject of last video, and you'll see her a lot in this video as well. She lives on an outpost in the middle of the sea, and she's there to catch sparks that fly across the world in predictable patterns called runs. Hence Atlantic Spark Run. It's going to be her and someone on the end of a radio who's working on another outpost on the same line called Wren, and there's also going to be another character called Osum who is there to sort of deliver a monthly ration to her, and it'll be focused on what her life is like all by herself. I hope that made sense. If it didn't, then I would encourage you to watch the first video on my channel. That'll have a bit more explanation about what's going on. So this video is mostly about prototyping. In the last one, I was working on sculpting and printing the first prototype of Sally as quickly as I could, just to get that first thing there, see what works and what doesn't. And it turned out that a lot of things didn't work. So these past couple of weeks, I've been working on refining that, and you'll see me talk about the joints to start with, which was the biggest problem with the previous version. I'll go through prototype 2, and then I'll go through prototype 3, and talk about the process along the way, talk about the various specific things that don't work, the specific things that do work, and I'll sort of let you in on my process of sculpting and refining. So I've been doing some testing. Since the elastic joints didn't really work very well, I had a couple of ideas about how to tackle that. The first was just a friction fit, which is what these ended up being. So it's just a socket piece and a ball piece and nothing more than that. It's basically as simple as just putting the ball in the socket and then using friction from both PLA pieces to stiffen that movement. This is the first one I did, and already, without any more testing or anything like that, this is already leagues better than the elastic that I was using before, so that was a really promising start. The second idea was a similar kind of thing. It's all based on friction, but this hole here was intended to have a hex nut in it, and the nut would hold a grub screw that would then hold the ball part together in a sort of tightening force, and what that allows me to do is dial in the stiffness of that joint. And actually, as you can see, there isn't one in there because I put it in, and as I was screwing it, even though I sort of super glued it in, the force of the screw on the ball, rather than pinching it like this, what it was doing was it was hitting the ball, stopping there, and then as I screwed it, the nut was coming out of its hole, and once it come all the way out, it fell out and got lost on the carpet somewhere. So it could have worked, but since just the friction fit seemed quite promising, I decided to follow this a bit further rather than try and do that anymore. I did talk in the previous video about a third idea, which was to have a socket more like this with the slits in it, and then have some kind of tightening mechanism that would tighten the socket around the ball. So if you think about a Jubilee clip, if you don't know, it's basically a ring of metal like this, and it's got a screw thread on this end, and as you screw this, it tightens the ring, so it pulls one of the sides around. But the problem that I ran into there was that either I'd have to have really, 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 really tiny screws to be able to fit in. You can see how thick this side is. This is 1mm, or have something jutting out the side. And I didn't want to do that because that would make the shape of Sally's body a bit weird, and that's something that I only worked out as I started modelling it. So I kind of didn't even try and do that. So carrying on with just the friction fit without any screws or anything like that. The two versions I carried forward were this solid one like this, and this one with slits. And the idea of the slits one was that this space would give the PLA a little bit of extra kind of flexibility, so that if I made the ball bigger, than the socket, rather than just pushing the socket apart, these tongues, I suppose, would take up that flexibility and still apply a pressure onto the ball. And this sort of works. I can't really tell much of a difference between the slitted ones and the solid ones. And I think that's probably because the pressure is being put into the seam rather than into these tongue flaps. It's probably the way that I glued it. With most of them, I glued it only in a few spots. So like here and here, which means that gives the sides an opportunity to pull apart. Like that. This one isn't glued together, but this is what was happening when it was glued. It's not so much that the fingers are taking that flexibility, it's that it's pushing this apart, and that's where that is coming in. So in the end, these weren't as useful as I thought they would be. And that might change if I sort of glued the entire thing up together, but I didn't really want to glue any bit around the socket because I thought that might get in the way of this action here, because there's not a lot of space in there. So going on to how I went through my iterations. As I said, this is the one that I took forward. The thickness here is 1mm, so that's really, really thin. And it does print well. You can see the flexibility in there, that's what I was hoping to happen. It does print well, but it is slightly too thin. What's nice is that you can snap the ball in like that, and there isn't any sort of cracking in the seams here. And it is relatively stiff, at least compared to the elastic version, but it is a bit too loose, I think. What I was thinking about when I was doing this was how much of a levering action this would have on this ball and socket joint. Because if you think, like, let me just get Sally over here for a second. This is how long her forearm is, or her arm in general. And if you think about how much more length there is there, that's an extra maybe 4 or 5 times the length of this thing. So already you've got 4 or 5 times more force as a moment force on here. So if you think about it, like a weight of 10 grams or something like that, it's going to be putting a certain amount of force on here. But if it was 5 times further away, that would be giving it 5 times, so it'd be equal to having 50 grams on the end of this one, if I remember my mechanics classes from a decade ago. I don't think that her clothes are going to be that heavy, but they will be putting force on her joints, so there's that to consider as well. And at the moment, I'm not quite sure how much force that's going to be. So I think at the moment it's better to err on the side of being too stiff rather than less stiff. And for me, this feels like it won't hold up under all of that weight at the end of her arms and things like that. I then went on to this one, which is, as I said before, it's 2mm thick, which is twice the size, and actually it looks like a bit more than that, and I think that might be to do with how the print works. It's never going to be exactly precise. There's always a bit of expansion in the print as it comes out. This is a lot stiffer. I have to sort of hold it together, because as you can see, it's really pushing that apart, and actually that would just fall out if I let it. But when it's like this, if I'm putting a bit of pressure on there to hold it together, that's a really nice stiffness, and it also holds its position really, really nicely. However, what I wanted to test was an in-between 1.5mm thickness of this to see if that's the kind of Goldilocks zone, and also I wanted to test a couple of different sizes of ball to see how well it fits in the socket. So in this one, which is the third test that I did, I've got a small, medium and large, and you can't see the difference here because it's really minuscule, and I think this worked really well. I think the 1.5mm is a nice, as I said, Goldilocks zone between the 1mm thin and the 2mm thick. Pops in nicely. There is a little bit of opening of the seam here, but that's okay, I think, because it's still holding it. So this is the small ball in the solid socket. I think this one works the best. There are very slight variations between all of them. In this one, they're all slightly looser, but for my purposes, I think the small ball in the solid socket works the best. The large ball in the solid socket is very, very slightly too stiff, I think. Not that it doesn't work, but I think that it might cause problems to how still the figure is on screen when I come to move each joint. Like if it's too stiff, I might end up pushing her out of position in other places, which is not good. And then this one is very slightly too loose, in my opinion. I'm still a bit worried about how much moment force there's going to be on the sockets, and this was just into the sort of yellow zone of worry there, so that's why I'm not using that one. There's a couple of bits that are slightly annoying. So at the moment, that's the maximum angle that I can bend that at. So if this is the elbow joint, for example, that's her upper arm and this is her forearm. Unless you've got something seriously wrong with your elbow, you can bend your elbow so that your forearm's almost touching your shoulder. So this would be essentially sort of like up here like this. And obviously that's not far enough. So I think what I'm going to do for those sorts of ones that are more of a lever action, so the knee joint as well, what I'm going to do is make this socket come out a bit more, so it ends maybe about here, and then have a slot for this part to sort of like move around in. I might put the diagram up on screen, so I don't know how well I'm explaining this. So it can move like this, and it can still twist, but it doesn't have the restriction of only getting to there. The other joint that I want to talk about is the shoulder and the hip joint, because your arm can move closer to your body than that, obviously. What I think I'm going to do is, rather than have a ball that's like this with a ball with a stick that's coming out of the centre, I think I'm going to put it on the side of it, so it'll be coming out from there and then downwards. So we think of this as just a ball for a second. The arm will be coming out kind of like that, rather than out straight from the centre. Maybe a bit like that. And I think that will get around the problem of it colliding with the edge of the socket. So I'll leave that there and get to modelling the rest of Sally. So this is the second prototype of Sally. And as you can see, there's a number of changes that I've made to the joints. So for example, the hip joint is now an actual ball and socket joint, similar to how a real hip bone works, compared to how she was before in the elasticized version. You can see that's what that hip looks like. You can see that's quite different there. Because it all works on friction, I've had to change a lot of these joints. Most of them are all enclosed now rather than open. So the knee joints and the elbow joints, wrist and ankles, they're all enclosed, and this is just so that she doesn't fall apart. So the thing that's keeping her together is the fact that the balls cannot move out of their sockets rather than through elastic tension. However, with this one, most of them are fine, but the shoulders and hip joints are slightly too loose, so that's why she's laid out like this. She would be standing up otherwise. Yeah, you can see her arm just fell off. I didn't even touch that side. And similarly, her hips as well. So in the next prototype, I'm going to be locking these up. So you can imagine if there's a bisector right through the sphere, then that can very easily come out. And what I was trying to do was move that over so that this opening here is smaller than the widest part of the sphere, so it can't actually get out. But it looks like on the hips and the shoulders, I didn't quite manage to do that. So the next prototype, I'm just going to move that bisector over a bit. So where it was sort of there, I'm going to move it up to there, just so that they don't actually have the opportunity to fall out. Otherwise, most of the joints seem really, really good. The friction works really nicely, so you can see that she's holding her position now. There are a few pieces that are still a little bit loose, so this knee here, it's kind of alright, but it does tend to sort of flop around just a little bit. So what I'm going to do with the next prototype is just make the socket slightly smaller, or the ball slightly larger, so that there is more friction in there. Other things that worked well are the twist in her body. So that works quite nicely. You can see that her shoulders are out of line from her hips, as if she's looking over her shoulders. Her head, her neck joint, works quite well. I mean, that seems quite limited, but I think it's an appropriate amount of movement in there. Her socket inside her head is also quite loose, so that just comes off. But I think that's kind of okay because this is not a structural piece. So, if her leg fell off, then she would fall over, but if her head fell off, then the rest of her body would still be there. I've also done a couple of things with how her face comes onto the back of her head. So it's still magnetized, but I put a couple of things in just so it registers a bit better. And I've done this thing where the socket is in the back side of the head, so the face can come off and on freely without interrupting whatever's happening on model. I think her feet are a bit small. Your feet are kind of like a balancing point, so there isn't a huge amount of kind of stability there. So I'm just going to make them a bit bigger in the next prototype so that gives her a bit more stability. So because I printed this slightly smaller, this is 1:10 rather than 1:8, and that is just completely by mistake. I forgot to rescale it. It does mean that her wrists and ankles didn't have space to put a magnet in. So what I did was put a little bit of plasticine in there so that it gives it a bit of stickiness to hold on to, and actually that works fairly alright. They come off and on quite easily, so that's not too much of a problem if I need to change out the hands. This joint might be a bit too far back if you look at how your hand folds. it sort of folds at the heel there, which would really be sort of where that hand ends at that line there. But I've taken the pivot back a bit further, so it sort of creates a slightly odd shape there. But something I have found is that I thought when I was designing it, I had taken into account the full range of motion of this arm. But what I realised was that if I wanted this to be the elbow pivot, I wouldn't be able to make motions like this, because this arm is locked into this rotation. Where that pivot is, it can only pivot this way, which is not quite right. So what I'm going to do with the next prototype is make this joint more like her hip joint, so that there is some rotation in the upper arm. But overall, even though she's in pieces at the moment, this is much more successful than the elastic version. So prototype number 3, getting there. You might have noticed at first that she's missing a hand. I do actually have it here, but as I was putting it together, I was sort of clamping it with some pliers and kind of pinged off somewhere because I was clamping it too hard, and this wrist piece got broken off and lost somewhere because it's tiny. So she doesn't have a right hand, but I'm not quite sure if that is like a particularly good mechanism to do it anyway. Right, so it's quite a lot of good progress from prototype 2. All of the things I mentioned in the last section have mostly been addressed. The only thing that hasn't is the hands. So the shoulders and the hips are now more enclosed, so they don't fall off. She can stand up. She looks a bit menacing like that, doesn't she? Stare up into the camera. She looks like she's going to fight you or something. So that's good. All of the joints are pretty stiff, which is great. Her head still comes off. The last one was split in two down the middle, and I think because of that, when I was gluing it together, it allowed for some play in how much space the socket was giving to the ball. But since the socket now is only one piece, there isn't so much flex in there, so it has a lot more kind of grip on the ball. Also, I've changed her face mechanism. This is pretty good now. So it's still the satisfying kind of snap-on, but there's less play in the seam here. There's still a bit of a gap, but I don't think I'm ever really going to get rid of that. But it's much more stable now. That play there that you see is from all of her head moving. It's not the faceplate moving around the back of the head, which is great. So that all works as one piece now, and that's probably thanks to this big piece in here with a corresponding socket on the inside that are quite close fitting. The hands and the wrists, I still haven't really figured this out. So we've got a wrist piece here, which is similar to the last one. There's a ball and a sort of peg, but then there's half of the heel of the hand here. The problem with this is that this is quite loose. I did play with having like an interface between these two pieces that would stop this twist from happening, but I never really got the geometry in Blender to work properly. That might have just been a tired brain moment. So that still needs work. But apart from this, I think it's all working pretty well. I really like how it is at the moment. All of the things I mentioned before about the cut-ins and things like that, that's really nice. Her shoulders now have a great range of motion. There are a few bits that she's missing, but overall it's pretty good. Like she can go all the way up, she can go quite far back, go out to the side, turn around, turn upwards. So that's really good. I'm really pleased with that. And similarly her hips as well. There's lots of motion in there. She can go out to the side if I just move her arm away. This is going to be the last part of this video. I'm not really going to do very much more to this. In fact, after uploading this video, the next stage of work I'm going to be is on working with her clothes. The only real issue that I've got left with the printing and the modelling is her hands and her wrists. And it's a problem that has multiple solutions. And I could be spending weeks just going through all of them and testing which one works. And I'm not sure I want to sort of stagnate in that way. I don't want to continue doing the prints and the modelling. I want to sort of move on to doing other things just so I can get my brain working in the background, so that when I come back to this problem I can maybe come at it with a few ideas. So yeah, really pleased with how this has gone. I hope it has been interesting to see the process of prototyping from the initial elasticized Sally, who is kind of falling apart now. This is going to look a bit like Sid's bedroom from Toy Story. I had to take her head off because I ran out of magnets for prototype 3. Yeah, so we've got prototype 1 here with the elastic, prototype 2 and prototype 3, which I think works nicely. They're going to stare at me when I go to sleep tonight. So that'll be fun. But yeah, really, really pleased with this.